Hi, I'm Jay Hurst. Keep an eye out for a new episode of The Devil's Lettuce every Monday, where I'll interview industry professionals and like-minded people who are leading the way in the cannabis industry. Jarryd Bartle has a diverse background in criminal law, public health research, and is a casual university lecturer at RMIT Uni. He has previously published news articles on The Conversation and HuffPost Australia. Jarryd provides expert opinion on the intersections of law and human sexuality, criminal justice reform, and drug policy. He'll be speaking today on the intersection of medicinal cannabis legislation and drug driving laws. Jarryd, welcome to The Devil's Lettuce. Could you elaborate on that intro and let the listeners know how you got into your field?
Well, thanks for having me on. I have quite a diverse background, as you indicated, and it's mainly because I'm so fascinated by both cultural understandings of drug consumption and what those things mean and how they've been treated differently politically over time. But I'm also a big regulatory nerd who likes to know about the intricacies of laws that are passed and the impact of those laws. So my undergraduate degree was actually in forensic science. So I majored in forensic chemistry with a heavy emphasis, of course, on drug chemistry. I went on to study law, practiced as a criminal solicitor, as you said, for a period of time, and then moved on to a more consultancy role, consulting government bodies, but also not-for-profit harm reduction organisations, groups like that, about the intersection of the law and regulation and all those complex things with our developing understanding of drugs and how drugs are treated politically.
Okay, so if we're talking in regard to roadside testing, how does a roadside test detect delta-9 THC?
So it does so via a saliva test, and if you're ever pulled over, there are actually two tests that are done. The first one, it's known as a presumptive test. It's the drug wipe test. So you'll be asked to put an absorbent pad on your tongue, and then the officer who's pulled you over will put it through this immunoassay test, which will come up with either a positive or a negative result for THC in saliva. You'll then, if you get a positive result, be asked to provide 1 ml of saliva for some further testing, and then it's put through another test. Again, it's an immunoassay test called a Rapiscan test, and that just essentially comes up with an answer as to whether or not THC is present. Rather controversially, these types of testing devices will just tell you whether or not delta-9 THC is present. So unlike urine testing or blood testing, which looks at metabolites of THC, mainly kind of carboxy THC, these saliva tests will just say that either THC exists in the sample or it doesn't. It won't tell you potential concentration, and probably more importantly from a roadside testing standpoint, it's probably not going to tell you how recently that person has consumed THC or how impaired they are.
Okay, so could you explain what the current drug driving laws for medical patients prescribed cannabis in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland are?
Well, there are no distinctions currently in place providing exceptions for medicinal cannabis. So what that means is that the current drug driving offences that apply in those jurisdictions, and if I can just briefly explain, that there's a distinction between drug detection offences where, if you fail the roadside drug test, you've committed an offence, and a separate set of offences that are known as impairment offences, which do rely on the drug testing but also will assess your behaviour to determine whether or not your driving has actually been impaired. As it currently stands, there are no exceptions in place for medicinal cannabis patients, so they are potentially liable under those drug driving offences.
Okay, could you explain the impairment testing for people who might not know about that?
So in terms of impairment testing, if you've ever seen a bad US TV show like Cops or something like that, you'll be aware of those kind of DUI tests that they do. standing on one leg and, pointing to your nose back and forth, that sort of stuff. They're the kind of things that get assessed by Victoria Police if they think that somebody is under the influence of either a legal or an illegal substance. So it's not just, illicit substances here. If they appear to be impaired, there are actually physical signs that the officers are trained in to determine whether or not you've been impaired.
Okay, so is it something that they just, they might just watch how you're acting and what you're doing, or is it something that they do like in the US and they do get you out of the car to perform certain things?
I'm trying to think of the specifics of the test itself. I don't think there's a walking in a straight line type component to it.
Okay.
But it is a standardized test called the Standard Impairment Assessment Test. I know one of them is focusing on a point in space, and they'll look to see whether or not you're able to focus on a single point. So those are the sorts of things that they'll assess for.
Okay, so what are current medical cannabis patients expected to do when using their medicine and driving, given the information you've just shared?
Well, unfortunately, unless there are some changes to how the current laws apply, the advice that I imagine a standard lawyer would give to a medicinal cannabis patient would be, don't drive until you know that you don't have a detectable amount of THC in your system. And that's quite a complicated thing to assess individually. So the saliva test that I was talking about earlier, they will pick up delta-9 THC in saliva within a 72-hour window. So if you have consumed medicinal cannabis 72 hours prior, it would still be detectable in saliva. And those window periods also vary depending on the potency of the cannabis and certain individual factors. So it could actually be quite difficult for an individual person to know whether or not they're driving not in compliance with the law. There was an interesting proposal put by a Greens member whose name escapes me actually at this point in South Australia to actually provide a formal defence to drug driving charges on the basis that it is a medicinal cannabis product. And as far as I know, that's not going to be adopted in South Australia, and I am not aware of any proposals similar to that in Victoria, New South Wales or Queensland.
Okay, so how does an Australian medical cannabis user travel with their medicine, say, domestically?
So possession is a bit clearer. If you are acting in compliance with the law that applies in that jurisdiction, so if you have been validly prescribed a medicinal product, having it in your possession will not result in a drug offence. So in that area, they've thought ahead and they've said, well, no, if somebody is acting in compliance with the law, even if, in the other circumstance, being in possession of cannabis would result in a criminal offence, if they are complying with the regulatory landscape, you won't be charged with a possession of offence. And that would work interstate. Things get a bit trickier when we're talking about travelling overseas because, of course, you would need to consider importation offences that could apply on the receiving country.
Okay, so those sort of laws, would that include something like maybe keeping the prescription on you or?
Yes, I mean, that would be a recommendation that you have the prescription on you and that you can easily deal with that situation by just referring to your prescription. Unfortunately, in terms of failed drug driving tests, though, that's not necessarily going to let you off the hook because there's nothing in the law to say failing a drug driving charge shouldn't apply to people who are consuming cannabis medicinally.
Do you know of any innovative roadside tests that could test the driver's potential impairment? I mean, we talked a little bit before about the impairment testing, but is there a test that's not based on the presence or the absence of THC? Yeah,
look, so there's a lot of potential technologies that are being put forward. I mean, there are kind of two main hurdles. First of all, to do a roadside test, obviously you don't want to be, taking someone's blood, for example, or requiring people to give urine samples on the side of the road. So a roadside test needs to be able to be outlaid in everyday life in an everyday policing scenario. And we don't currently have an equivalent to a breathalyzer for THC. Even if we did have a breathalyzer, though, there is a more complicated issue that if you are detecting a certain level or a certain concentration of THC metabolites in someone's blood, if you can actually come up with a good number for that, we don't have enough evidence to actually say at what concentration somebody is impaired. Norway has attempted to come up with a standard to that. So they talk about 3 nanograms per mil of THC metabolites as being equivalent to a 0.05 blood alcohol reading. But there's been a lot of criticism of that because it hasn't been adequately tested and proven that if your blood concentration of metabolites reaches that level, that you're necessarily impaired. And within the context of medicinal cannabis, it gets even more confusing because your levels of metabolites for certain drugs might be different for you if you suffer from certain medical conditions. In particular, if you have issues with your liver, for example, we know that that can impact blood concentration levels of metabolites. And so that throws a whole lot of other things in the mix as well. The only other kind of testing or genre of testing that I've seen that tries to avoid all of this is to actually look at some of the physiological signs of THC impairment or THC impacts on the body. There is one particular company, I can't remember the name of it, but I'm not going to give it free promo, so that's fine. That is all about measuring pupil size, for example, and wants to use that to come up with an answer of a level of impairment. Again, all of this, I personally think that we should be skeptical about. Those roadside drug driving tests were really rushed into. And they're having a whole lot of issues where they're getting people who, have either consumed cannabis long before they were actually impaired, and they also raise issues to do with things like passive smoking and all these other things. I wouldn't want to see any new test be outlaid into roadside testing unless we have, a long period of actually proving that it's likely to work in the field.
Okay, so some listeners might be thinking, do roadside tests test for CBD or any other cannabinoids?
So the roadside tests that are currently in place test for THC, Delta-9 THC, the saliva tests.
Okay. If you could, what would you change for the current medical cannabis laws in Australia?
I'm of the view that medical cannabis should be treated like any other medicinal product or therapeutic good. I find separate regulation in relation to medicinal cannabis a bit strange, just from a regulatory perspective. The kind of extra red tape involved with medicinal cannabis, the licensing, the prescriber limits, all these sorts of things are unnecessary in my eyes and are actually quite wasteful in terms of how they're currently being implemented. I would be more inclined to just have medicinal cannabis be treated like any other therapeutic good. In terms of drug driving laws, I think you could probably guess what I'm going to say, but clearly impairment should be the focus of drug driving laws, not whether or not you pass or fail a saliva test. So we really need to, if the current standard impairment assessment model doesn't work for THC, then we need to develop something that that the officers can implement in the field that isn't relying on these saliva tests, that you actually look at, well, are they listening to me as I'm talking? Can they focus? Those sorts of things seem to be way more relevant to me in terms of driving and safety than whether or not someone passes or fails a saliva test. I would just say a bit more broadly, with all these issues that we have around medicinal cannabis, I do genuinely believe that the only reason we have all these current hurdles in place is because of the current criminalization of cannabis. Now, that doesn't mean recreational legalization. Decriminalization of cannabis would at least make it clear the distinction between the police and the role of the police in relation to cannabis. If it's seen as purely as a health issue, not as a criminal justice issue, we probably would see a much more simplified system and one that works a lot better for patients.
What's a cannabis-related resource or tool that you can recommend to listeners, and why?
I think I've got two for you. So there is a website that I'm pretty sure only lawyers go to called Lexology, and it's a place for regulatory experts and lawyers to actually publish articles on certain topics. One of the kind of general themes of articles that is frequently put on Lexology is about Australia's regulatory approach to medicinal cannabis. So if there are any listeners of yours that are, regulatory nerds like me, that they're interested in the intricacies of medicinal cannabis and how regulation is working in that area, I do recommend Lexology. I think it's just lexology.com. If not, just Google Lexology. I think I've got that right. If you Google that, you'll be able to get on the Lexology website. The only other thing that I would recommend would be if you are pulled over for a drug driving offence, or you do get into issues with consuming medicinal cannabis, there are community legal centres in most areas that can provide you with some free legal advice, and it's a good resource to recommend to anyone, particularly in the medicinal cannabis space, just because there is an overlap with criminal justice and health matters. If you need to get in touch with a community legal centre, if you go to the National Association of Community Legal Centres website, there you should be able to select your postcode and find your local CLC.
Just touching on what you just said earlier, in your experience, is there any leeway with people who aren't prescribed medicinal cannabis but are using cannabis for medicinal uses?
Unfortunately not. I mean, in terms of the actual charge being proven, that's not something that can be raised. If you have been charged with a drug offence, a defence lawyer is probably going to raise the fact that you only had cannabis in your possession for personal medicinal use. So it can be used to mitigate the sentence, or in other words, lesser the sentence that could be imposed on you by mentioning that you're using it for medicinal use. But there's no formal defence in law that you're using an illegal drug for a medicinal purpose.
Okay. What vision do you have for medical cannabis in Australia?
As I said earlier, I think we just need to shift our mindset in viewing cannabis. In particular, taking it away from viewing it as something that is, inherently pernicious, that must be criminalized and it needs to be a focus of policing, into it being, a health product. I think that we really need to reshape culturally and legally in that regard, just so patients can have access to something that they need. Somewhat controversially, potentially, depending on what your listener base is, I am fairly conservative in terms of the evidence-based recommendations for medicinal cannabis. I would like to see a bit more research into the prescription of medicinal cannabis for certain disorders and illnesses first before it gets prescribed. But, the common things that are coming out of, the VLRC report and all these other internal reports in terms of medicinal cannabis, I think that it should be open to those patient groups as soon as possible.
To wrap up, could you let listeners know how they can follow your work and stay in touch with you?
Sure. I have a Twitter, so you can find me at Jarryd Bartle, and I've got a strange Y in my name, so I'll spell it out. So it's at JARRYD BARTLE. And as I noted at the start, I also do kind of professional consultancy work. So, if you can find me on LinkedIn as well, if people are interested in I guess, some more regulatory consulting or professional advice in this area.
Thanks for listening to the Devil's Lettuce podcast. If you enjoyed this show, we'd love you to subscribe, rate, and give us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you have a suggestion for a guest on the Devil's Lettuce, head over to thedevilslettuce.com.au and click on Suggest a Guest. Please do not take any information from the Devil's Lettuce or its guests as medical advice. Thanks for listening. See you next time.